She is becoming a burden. Benjamin Ashford said those words about his own wife quietly to his valet in the dark, like she was an account that wasn't balancing. Like 2 years of her quiet work, her careful loyalty, her sleepless nights protecting everything he'd built, amounted to nothing more than a line item. He regretted. What he didn't know, what no one in that house knew, was that she had already found the document that would destroy Thomas Whitmore completely. And she had found it because she never stopped reading what the men around her never bothered to open. If you've ever been the woman in the room that nobody listened to, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments, what city are you watching from tonight? Benjamin. Ashford had never once doubted himself at his own dinner table. He sat at the head of it, the way he sat at the head of everything, with the easy authority of a man who had built something real and knew it. 14 guests filled the long table around him. Merchants, landowners, 2 members of parliament who owed him quiet favors. Crystal caught candlelight. Wine moved without being requested. The whole evening ran on the invisible machinery of a household managed so well that no one thought to ask who managed it. No one thought to ask because the answer was sitting right beside him. Abigail. She wore dark blue. She had chosen it herself, without consultation, the way she did most things with quiet certainty and no need for approval. She had her father's precise posture and her mother's dark eyes, and a mind that had been running calculations since the moment Thomas Whitmore opened his mouth 40 minutes ago. She was listening, not the way the other guests listened, nodding along, riding the current of Whitmore's confidence. She was listening the way her father had taught her to listen to a contract being read aloud, for what was said too smoothly, too quickly, too generously. For the word that carried more weight than the speaker wanted you to notice. Whitmore was holding court from 3 seats down, and every man at the table was leaning toward him like iron filings toward a magnet. The Hartfield shipping lanes are the key, Whitmore said, his baritone filling the room without effort. Once we consolidate the northern routes under the Ashford seal, you'll have dominance from Liverpool all the way to Edinburgh. No competitor will touch you. The Parliament member lifted his glass in something close to a toast. Benjamin's chest visibly expanded. Abigail set down her fork. She had read the Hartfield agreement. 3 nights ago, when Benjamin left his study, unlocked, and she had gone in to leave him a note about the household accounts, and found the document sitting on his desk, like something left in plain sight, because no one expected plain sight to matter. She had not intended to read it. But the title caught her eye, and then the first page caught her breath, and she stood at his desk in the dark, reading by candlelight, until her legs ached and the house had gone fully silent. She read it 3 more times after that. She knew what it said. She knew what it didn't say. She knew what it was designed to make a man like Benjamin miss. Benjamin. Her voice was not loud. It never was. But it was precise the voice her father had given her. Never raise it when the words are clear enough to carry themselves. The table went quiet. Benjamin turned. There was a flicker in his eyes, not concern. Irritation. The look of a man who is enjoying himself and does not want the current shifted. I believe there is something unusual about the Hartfield contract, she said. The silence stretched 1 beat too long. Whitmore's smile stayed exactly where it was. But behind it, something moved fast and invisible, the way a hand moves under a table. His eyes came to her with a new quality of attention. The attention of a man who has just noticed a door he thought was locked, standing slightly open. Benjamin's expression settled into something cool and absolute. Abigail. The voice he used with footmen who had misunderstood. Tolerant. Barely. This is a matter beyond your understanding. Clarence Hobbs, wool money borrowed accent, seated to Whitmore's left, made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but wanted to be. Whitmore lifted his wine glass with the magnanimity of a man dispensing charity. Your wife is clearly devoted, Mr. Ashford, but business of this nature requires a certain depth of experience. Benjamin nodded. Exactly. 1 word. Abigail picked up her fork. She took a small bite of fish that had gone cold. She kept her face perfectly arranged, the face her mother had shown her how to hold in rooms where men decided things about you without looking at you. But something in her chest closed quietly, like a door shutting on something that had been trying for a long time to stay open. She had not expected to change anything tonight. She knew better. She had not expected Benjamin to stop the dinner, or take her seriously, or ask what she meant. She had learned in 2 years of marriage to this man that the time for her words was never now. It was always later. Or never. But she had hoped. She had always stubbornly kept hoping. The evening continued. Whitmore's laughter arrived at regular intervals, precisely timed like a musician who knows exactly which note keeps an audience comfortable. Benjamin glowed in the warmth of it. The Parliament member made a joke. Someone called for more wine. Abigail smiled when looked at. She answered when spoken to. She did not exist to anyone in that room as a person with a thought worth hearing. She existed as a decoration beside a man who didn't need decorating. Past 11 the guests began to leave. She stood with Benjamin at the entrance and was gracious and warm and entirely invisible. Thomas Whitmore was last. He took Benjamin's hand in both of his, the grip of a man communicating more than a handshake can hold. "We finalized next Thursday," Whitmore said. "I'll have the updated agreement sent by Wednesday." "I look forward to it," Benjamin said. Whitmore turned to Abigail as if remembering an afterthought. "Mrs. Ashford." A slight inclination of his silver head. "A pleasure as always." His eyes for one fraction of a moment were not warm. They were the eyes of a man taking inventory. "Indeed," Abigail said. The door closed. Benjamin turned away from it immediately, loosening his cravat with the satisfied exhale of a man at the end of a good day. "That went well?" he said to no one in particular. Abigail said nothing. She went upstairs. She did not go to sleep. She sat in the small room adjacent to their bedroom, the room Benjamin called her morning room, as though anything she did in it only mattered before noon, and she opened the notebook she kept in the locked drawer of her writing desk. The notebook no one knew about. The one she had been filling page by careful page for 6 weeks. Her handwriting was small and extremely neat. Her father had been a merchant's bookkeeper before he built his own modest business, and he had given her the same precision he applied to ledgers. Every number mattered. Every word in a contract was placed with intention. Every clause that looked like a formality was there because someone somewhere had needed it to be. She turned to the pages she had written after reading the Hartfield agreement. The shipping lanes. Whitmore had described at dinner, yes, they were real. The consolidation would on its face give Benjamin's operation a genuine advantage in the north. A man who trusted the surface of things would stop reading there. But buried in section 14, written in a font so small she'd had to bring the page nearly to the flame to read, it was a clause about what Whitmore's legal language called navigational rights reversal. Plain language. If the consolidated operation failed to meet a specified revenue threshold, within 18 months the rights didn't expire. They transferred to Whitmore's holding company. Automatically. Without further negotiation. The threshold looked reasonable on first reading. That was the genius of it. Benjamin would look at that number and think, "We've done more than this easily. We can do this standing still." But Abigail had spent 3 evenings calculating the actual volumes required to meet it, accounting for seasonal variation, the cost of consolidating the routes, the operating expenses that would spike during the transition period. She had used her father's methods. She had checked her figures twice, then a third time. The threshold was not difficult. It was impossible. Thomas Whitmore was not proposing a partnership. He was proposing a trap. And Benjamin was going to walk into it on Thursday with a pen in his hand and a smile on his face, surrounded by men who were too busy admiring him to read what he was signing. Abigail closed the notebook. She pressed her hands flat on the cover. She thought about tomorrow. About trying again. About finding the moment, the precise, careful moment when Benjamin wasn't already 3 conversations ahead of his body. About framing what she knew as a question rather than a correction, the way her mother had taught her, because men received questions differently than they received being told they were wrong. She had tried that approach before, many times. The result was always the same. Patient tolerance at best, irritation at worst. And then the subject changed, and nothing moved, and she was left holding information that had nowhere to go. She went to bed. Benjamin came in an hour later. She kept her eyes closed. She heard him settle into the chair by the window. He did that sometimes, sat in the dark and thought. And then she heard the low murmur of his voice and realized he was not alone. The dressing room door was slightly open. Perkins. She almost let herself drift toward sleep. Then she heard her name. Abigail, yes. She means well. She always has. Perkins too low to make out words. Sometimes I wonder, Benjamin said, if marrying her was a mistake. The room went absolutely still, though nothing in it had moved. She's kind. God knows she's kind. And she tries. A pause. The sound of him leaning back. But kindness doesn't build an estate, Perkins. I needed someone who understood what this life requires. What I require. Perkins said something brief and soft. She interrupts at dinner. She questions decisions she hasn't the experience to evaluate. She makes me look... He paused. She makes me look as though I cannot manage my own household without my wife reviewing my work. A silence. She is becoming a burden. Quietly. With something that was almost sadness and was therefore worse than contempt. I don't say that with pleasure, but it's the truth. The dressing room door clicked softly shut. Abigail lay in the dark with her hands folded on the coverlet and her eyes wide open. The man she had married. The man whose estate she had quietly defended twice already, once against a neighboring solicitor testing a boundary claim, once against a supplier who had been overcharging for 3 seasons both times without telling Benjamin because she had known he would not receive it well, and the problem needed solving more than she needed credit for solving it. The man whose household she ran with such precision that he had never once had to think about it. That man had just told his valet she was a burden. She didn't cry. She had nothing left to waste on crying. She stared at the ceiling and thought about Thursday. She thought about Thomas Whitmore and Section 14, and what it would mean for this estate for the tenants on Ashford land, for the name Benjamin had spent his life building. If that contract was signed, and 18 months later, the northern routes transferred to a holding company that had been constructed with extraordinary patience specifically to swallow men like her husband. She thought about all of it. And then she made a decision. Not the decision to confront. Not the decision to plead. Not the decision to try one more time to speak in a register that men like Benjamin could receive without it threatening them. The decision to act. On her own terms, in her own way with the tools she had always had and had never once been given permission to use openly. She would not ask permission this time. In the morning she was at breakfast before him. She poured her tea, ate her toast, and when Benjamin came downstairs and found her already seated and composed, she gave him the same unremarkable smile she always gave him. "Good morning," she said. "Morning." He sat, reached for the coffee. "Don't plan anything for Thursday evening." "Of course," she said. He glanced at her briefly. Something in her steadiness registered as slightly unusual, though he couldn't have named it. "You're well. Perfectly well," she said. "Thank you for asking." He nodded and opened his letter. She watched the side of his face for a moment. The jaw she had once found strong and reassuring. The brow slightly furrowed as his eyes moved across whatever the morning had brought him. She thought, "I am going to save you, Benjamin Ashford. I am going to save everything you built. And you are not going to know I'm doing it until it's already done." She folded her napkin. She went back to her morning room. She opened her notebook to a fresh page, and at the top in her small, precise hand, she wrote, "What I know, what I need, what I must find before Thursday." And she began. The note she sent the next morning was brief. Not to anyone in Benjamin's circle, not to anyone who moved in the rooms where his name was spoken with admiration. She sent it to Edmund Farrow, her father's former business associate, who ran a modest counting house at the edge of the city and had known Abigail since she was 15 years old, and already reconciling quarterly accounts with a precision that made grown men look twice. She told Benjamin she was visiting a friend. I didn't ask which one. She drove the small carriage herself she always had, and Benjamin had long stopped commenting on it, having learned that Abigail's independence in small matters was simpler to accept than to fight. What he had not yet learned was that this independence extended to considerably larger matters. Pharaoh was a small man with ink-stained fingers and the kind of meticulous intelligence that had no interest in dining rooms or admiration. He poured tea without ceremony and sat across from her at his cluttered desk. "Tell me what you found," he said. She told him everything. The Hartfield Agreement, Section 14, the revenue threshold she had calculated 3 times. She opened her notebook and walked him through every figure. He listened without interrupting. He was one of the very few people in Abigail's life who had ever done that without fidgeting. When she finished, he looked at the ceiling. "The man's done this before," he said. Her pen stopped moving. "There was a case, 3, maybe 4 years ago. A family called Grenville. Whitmore came in with a consolidation proposal, very similar structure. Within 2 years, the Grenville shipping operation transferred entirely." He paused. "Lord Grenville took it as a personal failure. I don't believe he's recovered socially." "Are there others?" "Possibly. I can look." "I need documentation," she said. "Previous contracts if they still exist. Records of how the transfers were executed. The names of his solicitors." She closed her notebook. "I need it before Thursday morning." Pharaoh looked at her with an expression she had seen on his face before, the expression of a man recognizing something he deeply respects. "You're going to stop it," he said. "I'm going to stop it," she said. Not a question, not a hope, a statement of fact. He nodded once. "I'll send word by Wednesday evening." She drove home. She arrived before dinner. She came to the table and listened to Benjamin talk about his correspondence and the difficulty of reliable grain suppliers, and she asked questions and showed interest and gave absolutely nothing away. But everything had changed. The woman Thomas Whitmore had smiled past at dinner, the woman Benjamin Ashford had called a burden in the dark of his own house, was no longer waiting to be heard. She was building the case, and she had until Thursday. Tuesday passed in silence and precision. Abigail went through every remaining document in Benjamin's study, carefully returning each paper to its exact position, cross-referencing names and dates against her notebook. She found 2 previous agreements with Whitmore's associated companies. Smaller transactions. Nothing alarming on their face. But the pattern of relationship had been building longer than Benjamin knew. She wrote everything down. On Wednesday evening, the sealed letter from Pharaoh arrived. 6 pages of closely written notes, 3 copied documents, the Grenville agreement records of its aftermath, and the name of the solicitor who had managed the transfer. The same solicitor listed in the Hartfield Agreement. Abigail sat at her desk and organized everything with the precision of someone who had been doing this in one form or another since she was 15. Sorted by sequence. Connections noted. A clean summary written on a fresh sheet. She folded everything into her portfolio, the ordinary leather one that sat on her desk in plain sight that no one had ever thought to open. She looked at it. Tomorrow. Benjamin would dress in his best coat and drive to the city and sign a document that would begin the 18-month countdown to losing everything. Unless she walked into that room with him. She had not been invited. She had not been asked. She was, in the precise language her husband had used 2 nights ago, a burden. But the burden had done the work. The burden had found the evidence. The burden was the only person in Benjamin Ashford's life who had read every word of the document he was about to sign. She closed the portfolio. She went to dinner. She was warm. She was gracious. She asked about the meeting tomorrow. "Should be fairly straightforward," Benjamin said, with the confidence of a man who has never seriously considered being wrong. "Sign the agreement, have lunch with Whitmore, and the northern routes are secured." "I hope it goes well," Abigail said. He looked at her. That same brief flicker, something slightly off in her calm, that his instincts registered and his mind didn't follow. "Thank you," he said. She poured her tea. She thought, tomorrow, Benjamin Ashford. Tomorrow you are going to listen to me, whether you want to or not. Thursday morning arrived the way all consequential mornings do, ordinary on its surface, catastrophic underneath. Benjamin was up before 7. Abigail heard him moving through the dressing room with the particular energy of a man who believes the day holds only good things. She lay still for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds, the splash of water, the low exchange between Benjamin and Perkins, the efficient rustle of a man being prepared for a significant occasion. She rose without being called. She dressed herself as she always did, with quiet precision. The dark green wool. The brooch her father had given her the day she turned 18, the one he'd pressed into her palm and said, "Wear this when you need to remember who you are, Abby." She fastened it at her collar. She looked at herself in the glass for exactly 3 seconds. Then she went downstairs. Her portfolio was already in the hall, placed precisely where she'd left it the night before. She had not hidden it. She had not tucked it away, or left it upstairs, or made any pretense about the fact that she intended to carry it today. It sat on the side table beside Benjamin's leather satchel. The same satchel he used for every formal meeting, and the visual comparison was deliberate, even if no one but Abigail knew it yet. Benjamin came downstairs at 7:30. He was immaculate. He always was on days like this. The dark coat perfectly fitted the cravat, precisely tied his whole bearing, radiating the specific self-assurance of a man who has never seriously considered the possibility of being wrong. He stopped when he saw her. She was standing already in her outdoor coat, the portfolio in her hands. "You're dressed to go out," he said. "I am," Abigail said. "I'm coming with you to the meeting." The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. Benjamin looked at the portfolio. He looked at her face. He searched it for some sign that she was making a social request, that she wanted to ride along and wait in the carriage perhaps, or take tea somewhere nearby while he conducted business. He searched for the ordinary manageable version of this moment. He didn't find it. Abigail. His voice had that careful, patient quality, the one that was actually neither careful nor patient, only controlled. "Today is not a social occasion." "I know precisely what it is," she said. "That's why I'm coming." Perkins appeared silently in the doorway of the back hall, and then, with the extraordinary instinct of a man who has worked in great houses long enough to recognize the precise moment to disappear, vanished again without a sound. Benjamin set his satchel down on the table. "I don't know what you think will be accomplished. Then let me tell you." She kept her voice level, not cold, measured. "I have spent 6 days examining the Hartfield agreement, cross-referencing it against your estate accounts and Whitmore's previous dealings. I have found evidence that this contract is designed to transfer your northern shipping rights to Whitmore's holding company within 18 months. I have documentation. I have precedent from a previous case, a family named Grenville, whom Whitmore destroyed in the same manner 4 years ago." She did not pause. "I am coming to that meeting because I am the only person in this house who has actually read every word of what you are about to sign." Benjamin stared at her. It was not the stare of a man processing new information. It was the stare of a man trying to locate a framework for this moment that allowed him to remain in control of it. "You went through my study," he said finally. "Your study is not locked. That is not the point." "The point," Abigail said, "is that Thomas Whitmore is going to take everything your grandfather started and your father built, and you expanded, and he is going to do it legally, using a contract you will sign today because you trust him, and because no one in your circle has read carefully enough to stop you, except me." She met his eyes. "I am your wife. This estate is my home. Those tenants are my responsibility as much as yours. And I am asking you once to let me come." Another silence. This one longer. Benjamin looked at the portfolio in her hands, then at her face, then somewhere past her left shoulder at nothing in particular, which was where men like Benjamin Ashford looked when they were thinking things they couldn't yet organize into words. "If you're wrong," he said slowly, "the embarrassment will be considerable." "I'm not wrong." "You cannot know that with certainty." "Benjamin." Something shifted in her voice, not harder exactly, but deeper. The voice of someone setting something down that they had been carrying too long. "I have been right about the Calvert land boundary. I have been right about the Pemberton supplier overcharge. I have been right every single time I have brought you information about this estate. You have dismissed me every single time. And the estate has survived those other situations because I addressed them quietly without telling you, because I knew you would not listen." She stopped. Let that land. I am telling you now. Please listen. The clock on the hall table ticked 4 times. Benjamin picked up his satchel. Get in the carriage, he said. The drive to the city took 40 minutes. They did not speak much. Benjamin sat across from her with his hands resting on his knees and his eyes on the window, and Abigail sat with the portfolio on her lap and let the silence exist without trying to fill it. She used the time to review in her mind the exact sequence of what she intended to say and when. The order mattered. She had thought about it carefully, what to present first, what to hold back, what to offer as documentation, versus what to state outright. She had watched her father do this before difficult negotiations. You didn't lay every card on the table at once. You built the case the way you built a wall foundation first, then the weight-bearing elements, then the detail that made it airtight. When the carriage slowed, she was ready. The offices of Whitmore's solicitor occupied the upper floor of a building on a wide street lined with the quiet, authoritative architecture that English money preferred. Stone steps, brass fittings, the kind of entrance designed to make a man feel that proceeding is the natural and inevitable course of events. Benjamin stepped down from the carriage first and offered his hand to help her out. A small courtesy, automatic rather than intentional, but she took it without comment. They went in together. The meeting room was already occupied when they were shown up. Thomas Whitmore sat at the far end of a long table flanked by 2 men, one of whom Abigail recognized immediately as the solicitor whose name appeared on both the Hartfield agreement and the Grenville transfer documents. The other was a younger man, probably a clerk, who had a second copy of the contract aligned precisely in front of him, a pen laid at a perfect right angle beside it. Whitmore stood when they entered. His smile arrived immediately, full and practiced and warm. Benjamin, welcome. Then he registered Abigail. The smile remained, but something behind it recalculated, fast and invisible, unless you were specifically watching for it. And Mrs. Ashford, what a pleasant surprise. My wife will be joining us today, Benjamin said. His tone was neutral in a way Abigail recognized the tone he used when he had committed to something he wasn't yet certain about. She has some questions about the agreement. Whitmore looked at Abigail. His solicitor, a thin man named Carver, looked at the table. Of course, Whitmore said smoothly. We're delighted to have you, Mrs. Ashford. Though I imagine much of this will be rather dry for, not at all. Abigail sat down, opened her portfolio, and placed her papers on the table in front of her, with the calm efficiency of a woman who has been doing this her entire life, and is simply choosing to do it visibly today. I find contracts quite interesting, actually, particularly Section 14. The temperature in the room changed. It was not a dramatic change. No one raised a voice, or knocked anything over, or stood abruptly. It was the kind of change that happens in a room where intelligent people suddenly realize the landscape has shifted. A subtle lowering of temperature, a slight reorientation of attention, the way every person present seemed to become fractionally more still. Carver, the solicitor, looked at Whitmore. Whitmore's smile held. Section 14, he repeated pleasantly. The navigational rights provision. The navigational rights reversal provision, Abigail said. There's a meaningful distinction. She looked at the document she had opened to the correct page, though she didn't actually need to look. She knew every word. Specifically, the revenue threshold set at £4,200 for the first consolidated operating year. I spent some time calculating the actual shipping volumes required to meet that figure, accounting for seasonal variation and transition costs. She looked up at Whitmore directly. Would you like to tell Benjamin how you set that number, Mr. Whitmore, or shall I? Whitmore leaned back slightly in his chair. A barely perceptible movement. The movement of a man who has just realized that the room is smaller than he thought. Mrs. Ashford, he began, his voice still carrying that generous, authoritative baritone, I believe you may have. I also found some interesting information about the Grenville family. She pulled a page from her portfolio and placed it on the table face up, so anyone seated could read it. Arthur Grenville signed an agreement with Meridian Holdings, which I believe we all understand to be your holding company, in 1813. The agreement contained a revenue threshold that proved impossible to meet. The transfer of his shipping rights was executed in 1814. She set another page beside the first. The solicitor who managed that transfer is seated to your left. Carver's face did something complicated. Benjamin had gone very still. I should also mention, Abigail continued at precisely the same pace she had maintained since she sat down, because pace was everything, and she was not going to rush now, that I found a payment in Ashford Estates accounts from 18 months ago. A consulting fee paid to Meridian Holdings. No corresponding contract. No deliverable listed. £420. She looked at Benjamin. Not at Whitmore. At Benjamin. I believe that payment was extracted in advance to establish a financial relationship that would make the Heartfelt agreement appear to be a natural extension of an existing partnership. It was designed to make you feel already invested. Silence. Real silence. The kind that arrives when everyone in a room understands that the conversation has become something entirely different from what it was supposed to be. Whitmore recovered first. He was good, Abigail would give him that. He recovered with the speed of a man who had been in difficult rooms before and understood that the first person to speak after a silence usually controlled what came next. Mrs. Ashford, I appreciate your diligence, truly. He turned his hands upward, an open gesture generous nothing to hide. But these are circumstantial observations. The Grenville situation was entirely different, a question of market conditions, not malfeasance. And the Meridian payment was for consultancy work that was conducted verbally, which is common in verbal consultancy, for which there is no record, Abigail said. No letter, no summary, no acknowledgement from Meridian Holdings. Nothing in your correspondence with Benjamin mentioning work performed. £420 for something that left no evidence of existing. She tilted her head slightly. In my experience, Mr. Whitmore, work that is done tends to leave traces. Work that was never done tends to leave only a bill. Benjamin turned to look at her. She did not look back at him yet. This was not the moment. This was the moment for Whitmore. Whitmore's generous warmth had moved by small and careful degrees into something else. He was still sitting forward. He was still composed. But the temperature behind his eyes had dropped several degrees, and the smile, for the first time since Abigail had known him, had stopped reaching them entirely. You have made some interesting observations, he said. But observations are not evidence, and a woman's reading of a contract. Her reading, Benjamin said. His voice was quiet. Abigail registered it but didn't move. Whitmore paused. I beg your pardon. You said a woman's reading. Benjamin's voice had not risen. It never rose. But there was something in it Abigail had not heard before, a quality of attention sharp and pointed, aimed entirely at Whitmore. My wife has presented you with specific figures, dated documents, and a precedent case involving your own holding company and solicitor. I'd suggest you address the substance of what she's said rather than who said it. Another silence. This one had a different weight. Carver looked at his hands. The young clerk looked at the window. Whitmore looked at Benjamin Ashford with the expression of a man who has just watched the ground beneath a careful plan shift by several inches. The Heartfelt agreement, Benjamin said, is not going to be signed today. He stood. I'll want my own solicitor to review every document my wife has brought, including the Grenville materials. He reached across and collected Abigail's papers, all of them, carefully treating them with the precision of important things, and placed them in his satchel. We'll be in contact. Whitmore stood as well. Benjamin, I think you're allowing— I think, Benjamin said very quietly, that you should be considerably more careful about what you say next. He walked to the door, held it. Abigail closed her portfolio and rose. She did not look at Whitmore. She didn't need to. She had said everything she came to say. As she walked past Benjamin and through the door, she heard Whitmore say something behind her, something low and controlled that she couldn't quite catch. She didn't try. It didn't matter. What mattered was that she was walking out of that room with her husband, and the contract was still unsigned. They did not speak in the carriage on the way back. Not immediately. Benjamin sat with his satchel across his knees and his hands folded over the buckle and his eyes on the window again. Though this time, the quality of his attention was entirely different. He was not looking at the passing buildings. He was looking at something that only he could see somewhere behind his own eyes, and Abigail recognized the expression because she had seen it before on her father's face once, when he realized a supplier he'd trusted for a decade had been quietly skimming his margins for 2 years. It was the expression of a man recalculating. She waited. She was patient. She had always been patient. She had come to understand, not a passive quality, but an active one, a choice made repeatedly and with intention to allow things to arrive in their own time rather than reaching for them and breaking them in the reaching. After perhaps 10 minutes, Benjamin spoke. "The Calvert boundary," he said. She looked at him. "You said you handled it. When was that?" 14 months ago, Abigail said. "Their solicitor contacted our estate manager with a query about the northeastern field. The estate manager brought it to me because you were traveling. I reviewed the original survey documents and the estate deed and wrote a detailed response." She paused. The matter was dropped. "And the Pemberton supplier, last spring. He had been adding a handling charge that wasn't in the original supply agreement. I identified the discrepancy, wrote to his office, and referenced the original contract. He corrected the pricing in the next quarter." Benjamin was quiet for a moment. "You didn't tell me." "I tried," Abigail said simply. "With the Pemberton matter, I brought it to you over breakfast. You said it was a minor concern and you'd look into it. You didn't. 2 months later, I handled it myself." He said nothing. She looked at the window. Outside, the city was giving way to countryside. The wide fields and low stone walls of Ashford territory, beginning at the distance. She had loved this land the first time she'd seen it arriving here as Benjamin's new wife 2 years ago. She had walked the boundaries in that first autumn, not because anyone suggested it, but because she believed that a place you were responsible for deserved to be understood on foot at ground level, with the actual soil under your boots. Benjamin had found that eccentric. She had done it anyway. "How long have you been watching?" Benjamin asked. 6 weeks, she said. "Since you first mentioned the Hartfield proposal at the end of April." 6 weeks. He absorbed that. "You spent 6 weeks. It wasn't difficult to see the shape of it," she said. "The structure of the revenue threshold was the first indication. Once I identified that, I looked for precedent. Edmund Farrow helped me locate the Grenville materials." Edmund Farrow. Something shifted in his expression. "Your father's associate?" "Yes." "You went to him privately, without telling me?" "I did," she said, without apology, without explanation. Those had run out. Benjamin looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze steadily, the way she had held Whitmore's, not defiantly, not apologetically, but simply with the full weight of who she was, undiminished and unperforming. "I owe you an apology," he said. The words arrived unexpectedly enough that she needed a moment. "At dinner," he continued, his voice carrying a roughness that she suspected he was not entirely comfortable with. "When you raised the concern, and when I dismissed you in front of those men." "You did," she said. "It was wrong of me." She looked at him, at the line of his jaw, at the careful, uncomfortable discipline of a proud man saying something difficult because it was true. "Yes," she said. "It was." He looked away first. They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different silence than before. Not the silence of two people with nothing to say to each other, but the silence of two people who have just said something that will take time to fully land. When they arrived home, Benjamin went directly to his study. Not to dismiss what had happened, Abigail could see that. He went with the deliberate focus of a man who has just discovered that a situation he believed resolved is in fact live and dangerous and requires immediate attention. She heard him call for Perkins, then for the estate manager. Then she heard the scratch of his chair and the particular rhythm of a man writing quickly. She went to her morning room. She sat down at her desk, and she opened her notebook, and she wrote nothing for a long moment. Just sat with the open page and the afternoon light and the particular quality of this day, which was unlike any other day she had spent in this house. Then she picked up her pen and wrote at the top of a clean page, "What comes next?" Because the contract hadn't been signed, but Thomas Whitmore hadn't been defeated. A man like Whitmore, careful, patient, experienced in this specific kind of destruction, did not simply accept setbacks. He adapted. He reframed. He found new angles. She had stopped one move. She hadn't ended the game. She wrote quickly, because her mind was moving quickly, and the thoughts had the clarity that came after long periods of controlled tension, the clarity of a body released from held breath. Whitmore would almost certainly contact Benjamin's solicitor directly. He might attempt to renegotiate the agreement in ways that obscured the problematic provisions while preserving their essential function. He might approach one of Benjamin's associates, someone who trusted him and could exert social pressure for the agreement to proceed. He might, if he felt genuinely threatened, try to discredit Abigail's research, cast doubt on her methods, her sources, her competence. That last one was the most likely. She had seen enough of how these men operated to know that when a woman produced evidence, they couldn't immediately refute. The next move was rarely to engage with the evidence. It was to question the woman. She wrote, Edmund Farrow's copies must be independently verified. Need a second source for the Grenville transfer. She wrote, find out who Whitmore's other active negotiations are with. He won't have only one target. She wrote, Benjamin's solicitor. Does he have a relationship with Carver? She was still writing when a knock came at her door. Come in. It was Benjamin. He stood in the doorway for a moment, unusual for him. He was a man who entered rooms with decision, not hesitation, and then came in and sat in the chair across from her desk. The chair that had never been used for this purpose. The chair where she sometimes draped a shawl. He looked at her notebook. Still working, he said. Whitmore isn't finished, she said. Stopping one meeting doesn't end it. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped. In another man, this might look defeated. In Benjamin, it looked like concentration. Tell me what you think he'll do, he said. She looked at him. 4 words. Simple enough. And yet she had never heard them from him before. Not like this. Not with this quality of actual wanting to know, of treating her answer as something that mattered before she'd even given it. She turned her notebook toward him. 3 possibilities, she said. In order of likelihood. And she told him. He listened to all of it without interrupting. He asked 2 questions, both of them precise and relevant. The questions of a man engaging with a problem rather than managing a conversation. He looked at her notes. He looked at her face. He looked once at the brooch at her collar, the small gold one she always wore when she needed to remember who she was, and then back at her eyes. The second solicitor, he said when she finished. Carver. You said his name appeared on the Grenville transfer. Yes. I know who to contact to verify that independently. A man I was at school with, he's in law now, different firm. He'll be discreet. That would help considerably. He nodded, stood, then stopped. Abigail. He said her name the way he almost never said it, not as a preamble to a correction or a request, but as itself. Just her name. Why didn't you? He stopped. Started again. If you knew 6 weeks ago, why didn't you? I did try. She held his gaze gently, but without yielding. At dinner when I said there was something unusual about the contract. And before that in April, when I asked if I could review the preliminary terms. You told me the details were being managed. He looked at the floor. I remember, he said quietly. I know. He went to the door, turned back once. I'm going to write to my solicitor tonight, he said. And to my contact about Carver. I'd like your opinion. On the letter. She hadn't expected that either. Of course, she said. He left. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the room. Then she turned to a new page in her notebook. There was still so much to do. Whitmore was experienced and resourceful, and the kind of man who did not simply accept a setback and retreat. She had exposed the first layer of what he was doing, but she had told Benjamin the truth. She hadn't ended it. She had delayed it. To end it, she needed more. She needed the financial records from the Grenville transfer to be independently verified. She needed to understand who else Whitmore was currently negotiating with, because a man who ran this kind of systematic operation rarely had only one target at a time. She needed to know whether the consulting fee payment to Meridian Holdings could be recovered, or whether it had been processed in such a way that recovery was impossible, because if it was recoverable, that was leverage. And she needed very urgently to find out whether anyone had warned Arthur Grenville the way she was now warning Benjamin, because if someone had tried and failed, she needed to know how Whitmore had neutralized them. She had one possible source for that, a woman, Lady Grenville Arthur. Grenville's wife, who had remarried after the collapse of the Grenville estate and was now living quietly in Bath under her new name. Abigail had found a passing reference to her in Edmund Farrow's notes. She had written it down and underlined it. The question was whether Lady Grenville would speak to her. And the answer to that depended, Abigail suspected, on whether she reached her before Whitmore realized that Abigail had her name. She looked at the clock. The evening post would go out in an hour. She picked up her pen. She wrote quickly because in situations like this, speed was the thing that separated a good plan from a plan that arrived too late. She addressed the letter to Bath. She sealed it. She did not tell Benjamin, not yet, because she had learned, and this was perhaps the most important lesson of 2 years, married to a man who believed competence was a quality distributed selectively by gender, that the best time to tell a proud man how much work his wife has been doing on his behalf is after the work is done. Not during, not before, after. When the evidence was undeniable, and the outcome was secured, and there was nothing left for pride to protect itself with except the truth, she put on her coat and walked the letter to the post herself. Thomas Whitmore had built his empire on the assumption that the women in these rooms were decorative, that they were listening without comprehending, that they might notice things but would never act on what they noticed. He had built it on a lie, and Abigail Mercer Ashford, daughter of a merchant's bookkeeper, wife of a man who had called her a burden in the dark, was going to make absolutely certain he understood, before this was over, exactly how expensive that lie had been. The letter reached Bath in 3 days. The reply came in 5. Abigail was alone in her morning room when it arrived, and she recognized immediately that the handwriting on the outside of the envelope belonged to a woman who had once been accustomed to writing with confidence, and had somewhere along the way lost that confidence entirely. The letters were careful, too careful, the handwriting of someone who had learned to be small. She broke the seal. The letter was 2 pages. The first page was hesitant questions about who Abigail was, how she had found this address, what she intended to do with anything she was told. The second page was different. The second page had been written. Abigail suspected in a single sitting quickly, as though the woman had made a decision, and written before she could change her mind. Her name was now Catherine Hale. She had been Catherine Grenville, and she had tried to warn her husband. Abigail read the second page 3 times. Arthur Grenville had received the same kind of contract, had been shown the same kind of generous proposal, had been flattered in exactly the same way at dinner tables and clubs and private meetings where Whitmore's warmth and authority filled every corner of the room. Catherine had read the agreement. She had found the threshold. She had tried as Abigail had tried to tell her husband what she'd found. Arthur Grenville had not listened. But there was something else in the letter. Something Abigail had not anticipated, and the moment she read it, her hand went still on the page, and she sat very quietly for a full minute, just breathing. Catherine had not only tried to warn Arthur, she had also gone quietly, and without telling anyone, to Whitmore's previous solicitor, not Carver, but a man who had worked with Whitmore before Carver, and had left that association under circumstances that were never fully explained. His name was Gerald Mott. He had retired from practice and was living in Derbyshire. Catherine had gone to him because she suspected he knew more about how Whitmore's structure actually worked than anyone currently involved in it. She had been right. Mott had spoken to her briefly, nervously, with the manner of a man who had agreed to something he hadn't fully understood, and had spent years afterward wishing he could undo it. He had told Catherine one thing that no one else knew. Whitmore's revenue thresholds were not simply set high. They were actively manipulated after the contract was signed. Whitmore had an arrangement with 2 of the primary shipping brokers in the Northern Routes brokers, who controlled a significant portion of the available cargo contracts. Those brokers, paid a quiet commission by Whitmore's holding company, would decline to renew agreements with any operation in Whitmore's target range during the critical 18-month window, not visibly, not dramatically. Simply unavailable. Contracts that should have renewed didn't. New cargo agreements that should have materialized didn't materialize. The target operation found itself slightly short of capacity, month after month, in ways that looked like ordinary market variation, until the threshold wasn't met, until the rights transferred, until it was too late. Catherine had brought this to Arthur. He had listened finally, but by then, the 18-month window was already 8 months gone, and the brokers had already been working against them for most of that time, and the damage was done. At the bottom of the letter, Catherine had written, "I don't know if any of this helps you. I only know that I wish someone had known it before we did. Please, if you stop him, please make certain it is permanent." Abigail set the letter down. She picked up her pen. She wrote one line in her notebook. The brokers. Find out who they are. Then she put her coat on and went to find Benjamin. She found him in his study, which she entered without knocking, a thing she had never done before. He looked up from his desk with a flash of surprise, and then, registering her expression, something shifted in him. A settling and attention, the particular quality of focus she had seen from him only twice since Thursday. "Close the door," he said. She did. She sat without being asked. She placed Catherine's letter on his desk. "Read the second page," she said. He read it. She watched his face move through the contents. The initial concentration, the slight tightening around his eyes as he reached the section about the brokers, and then the stillness. The particular complete stillness of a man realizing that the threat he thought he'd paused was already moving. "The brokers," he said. "I need their names," Abigail said. "Which brokers handle the northern routes? Who would Whitmore have approached who has the capacity to quietly reduce cargo availability for an operation like Ashford's without it looking deliberate?" Benjamin set the letter down and leaned back in his chair. His expression had the focused sharpness of a man doing fast calculations. "There are 3 primary houses," he said. "Harwick and Sons, the Morton brokerage, and a newer firm, Callaway and Pierce. They handle the majority of cargo assignments for the northern lanes." He paused. "We have existing relationships with all 3. Have any of them behaved unusually recently? Delays in renewal, unexplained unavailability. Anything that seemed like ordinary market variation, but left you short?" Benjamin was quiet for 3 seconds. "Morton," he said slowly. 2 months ago, the Morton brokerage declined to renew 3 cargo agreements that had been standing for 4 years. Their man told my agent it was a capacity issue. I accepted that explanation." His jaw tightened. "I had no reason not to." 2 months ago, Abigail said. "The Hartfield proposal was formally presented in April. The targeting began before the contract was even offered." Benjamin looked at her. "He started narrowing the lanes before I'd agreed to anything," he said. "He needed to know the threshold was achievable before he made the offer," Abigail said. "If your operation was already running comfortably above the threshold, the contract would have been harder to execute. He needed to begin reducing your capacity first quietly, so it looked like the market, and then offer you the consolidation as the solution to a problem he had manufactured." The silence that followed was the silence of a man fully understanding, for the first time, the precise shape of what had been done to him. "He created the problem," Benjamin said, "and then offered to solve it." "Yes." "The Morton decline," he said. "If Morton is working with him, then we need to know about Harwick and Callaway as well. Whether they've received the same approach. Whether any of your current agreements with them are already compromised." Benjamin stood. He moved to the window, which was his habit when he was thinking hard, as though motion helped him process, or as though staying still felt like surrender. "If we expose the brokers," he said, "the arrangement collapses. Whitmore has no mechanism to manufacture the shortfall. The threshold becomes achievable without the interference." "More than that," Abigail said. "If the brokers have accepted payment from Whitmore's holding company while holding contracts with Ashford Estate, that's not just unethical. That is actionable." She pulled her notebook from her portfolio and turned it to the page where she'd written Edmund Farrow's notes about the Grenville case. In the Grenville collapse, 3 brokers were involved. None of them were ever identified publicly. Whitmore's legal structure was careful enough that everything appeared to be market forces. She met his eyes. He's been doing this for years because no one has ever gotten close enough to name the brokers before the transfer happens. We're close enough now, Benjamin said. We are, she said. But we have to move quickly. Whitmore knows the contract wasn't signed Thursday. He knows I presented documentation. He's had 5 days since that meeting, and a man like Whitmore does not spend 5 days doing nothing. Benjamin turned from the window. What do you need? He said. 3 words. She had been waiting 2 years to hear them delivered exactly like that. Not as patronage, not as management, but as one capable person, asking another capable person what resources they required. I need access to your broker correspondence, she said. All of it, specifically Morton, Harwick, and Callaway, going back 18 months. I need to see if there are patterns in how the declines and delays were communicated, whether the language is standardized in a way that suggests coordination. I also need your contact, the solicitor from your school. The one you mentioned for Carver. I need him to look at the Morton decline documents, because if there's a commission arrangement, it may have generated paperwork, even if it was designed not to be found. I'll have the correspondence pulled today, Benjamin said. Perkins can have it here by this afternoon. He paused. My contact is James Alderton. He's in the city. I can send for him tomorrow. Today would be better. Benjamin held her gaze. Today, he agreed. James Alderton arrived that evening. He was a compact, energetic man of about 40 with the quick eyes of someone who had spent 20 years reading documents designed to obscure rather than clarify. Benjamin introduced him without ceremony, and Alderton shook Abigail's hand with the brisk formality of a professional who had no interest in performing any gender-based adjustments to his manner. She liked him immediately. They sat in the study, all 3 of them, and Abigail walked Alderton through everything. The Hartfield Agreement and Section 14. The Grenville Case. Catherine Hale's letter. The Morton decline. The broker theory. She laid the papers out in the sequence. She had organized them, and Alderton moved through them the way she'd hoped he would, quickly asking precise questions, flagging specific elements, not wasting time on anything he could assess efficiently. At the Meridian Holdings payment, he stopped. £420, he said. Consulting fee, no contract. No documentation of any kind, Abigail said. He looked at her. Do you have the actual accounts entry, the original? She pulled it from the portfolio. He studied it. His expression did not change, but his eyes sharpened in a particular way. This entry was made by your estate bookkeeper. Yes, Benjamin said. In the normal course of business. Apparently. Alderton set the page down with a careful deliberateness. This payment was processed through your estate accounts in such a way that it appears as a standard operating expense, he said. Which means your bookkeeper received an instruction to record it this way, from someone with authority over the estate accounts. He looked at Benjamin. Who has that authority? Benjamin frowned. Myself, my estate manager Harris, and... He stopped. Abigail watched him. And, Alderton prompted, I gave Whitmore's man limited access, Benjamin said slowly. 2 years ago, when we first began discussing the northern routes, he said it was for due diligence purposes, so his team could verify our operating capacity before the partnership discussions advanced. His voice had gone very flat. I gave one of Whitmore's representatives access to my estate accounts for what I understood to be a brief review. Alderton picked up a pen. That representative's name, a man called Henson, Francis Henson. Alderton wrote it down. And was this access formally revoked afterward? Another silence. I assumed it had expired, Benjamin said. There was no formal agreement about duration. Which means, Alderton said carefully, it may not have expired. The room went very still. Abigail was the first to speak. If Henson still has access or had access until recently, he could have introduced that payment entry, she said. Not through the estate bookkeeper, but directly using whatever system your accounts are maintained on. She turned to Benjamin. Who maintains the physical ledgers? Harris, Benjamin said. But the secondary records, the journals that are reconciled quarterly, those are held at the counting house in the city. The same counting house that processed the Meridian payment, Abigail said. Alderton was already writing. This was the moment. Abigail felt it the way you feel a current shift in a river, not dramatically, not with any visible change in the surface, but in the pull beneath. Everything that had been supposition and pattern was crystallizing into something that had edges. This is not only a contract fraud, Alderton said without looking up from his notes. If that payment was introduced by Whitmore's representative without Ashford authorization, that is theft. Potentially multiple counts depending on whether there are other entries we haven't found yet. He looked up. Mrs. Ashford, have you reviewed the full 18 months of accounts, or only the period immediately preceding the Hartfield proposal? Only the preceding 6 months, Abigail said. I'll need the full 18. He looked at Benjamin. Tonight if possible. I'll have Harris bring them. Alderton nodded. Then he looked at Abigail with the expression she recognized, the same expression. Pharaoh had given her the expression of a man calibrating something he hadn't expected. Mrs. Ashford, he said, where did you learn contract analysis? My father was a merchant's bookkeeper, she said. He taught me. Alderton nodded once with the crisp respect of a professional. Then your father, he said, did a better job than most solicitors I've trained. Harris arrived with the ledgers at 9 o'clock. They worked until past midnight. Abigail, Alderton, and Benjamin. 3 people around a study table covered in ledger pages and correspondence, and the careful accumulating architecture of a case that was growing larger with every hour. Alderton reviewed the financial records with the systematic speed of a man who had done this kind of forensic work before. Abigail cross-referenced every entry he flagged against her own notes and the dates in Catherine Hale's letter. Ben, who had initially sat at the edge of the table in the manner of a man allowing experts to work, gradually moved closer until he was leaning over the pages alongside them, pointing out entries he recognized, providing context, contributing with the focused intelligence of someone who had built a substantial operation and knew its workings thoroughly. They found 4 more payments. Not to Meridian Holdings. Whitmore had apparently decided that using the same company twice risked creating a visible pattern. The 4 payments were to different entities, 3 companies, 1 individual, all of which, when Alderton cross-referenced them against the corporate registry, he kept in his briefcase connected back through subsidiary chains to the same parent structure. Whitmore's holding company. £2,300 in total, over 16 months. He was extracting capital the entire time, Alderton said. Not dramatically, not in amounts large enough to trigger obvious concern, small enough to appear as routine operating costs. He looked at Benjamin. He had someone inside your financial administration. Henson, Benjamin said. The word had a particular quality, not rage, not even anger exactly, but the cold, precise recognition of a betrayal that had been patient and systematic and invisible. Almost certainly, Alderton said. The pattern of entry timing matches the periods during which Henson would have had access. I'll need to verify that against his visit records, but... He paused, picked up one of the pages. There is one more thing. He placed the page in front of both of them. This payment, the 3rd one made in January, it's listed as a regulatory compliance fee, specifically for the northern shipping routes. His finger moved to the entry notation. Look at the reference number. Abigail looked. Then she looked at the Hartfield agreement, which was still on the table. The reference number in the estate ledger matched a section number in the Hartfield contract. He used the estate's own financial records to create the appearance that Ashford Estate had already formally engaged with the Hartfield framework, Abigail said slowly, before the contract was ever presented. If this had reached a court, Alderton said, and Whitmore's team had cited these payments as evidence of prior commitment to the arrangement, it would have significantly strengthened the enforceability of the transfer clause. He set the page down. He was building 2 cases simultaneously. The commercial case, the contract, and the brokers, and a legal case in case the commercial route was challenged. These payments were the legal backstop. The 3 of them sat with that for a moment. The full architecture of what Whitmore had constructed was extraordinary in its patience. Years of preparation, multiple layers, every contingency addressed, every potential objection preempted. He had done this before. He would have done it again. And he had almost succeeded, would have succeeded, if a woman he'd smiled past at a dinner table had not spent her evenings reading documents no one thought she'd bother to read. "We have enough," Alderton said. "More than enough. The financial entries alone constitute criminal fraud, independent of the contract provisions. The broker arrangement, which we'll need to verify, but your contact at Morton Benjamin should be sufficient to establish the commission structure." "I know someone at Morton," Benjamin said. "A junior agent who's been with them since before the current management. He's honest and he'll speak to me privately." "Get him on record," Alderton said. "His account combined with what we have here gives us a case that no court will ignore." He closed his notebook. "Whitmore is going to find this out, though. He has contacts everywhere. When he understands the scope of what's been assembled, he'll move to protect himself. He may try to discredit the documentation. He may try to reach your Morton contact first. He may try to reach Abigail," Benjamin said. His voice had changed. Both Alderton and Abigail looked at him. "He knows she's the one who assembled this," Benjamin said. "He knew it in that meeting room on Thursday, and now he's had 5 days to think about how far she might have gone." His expression was the expression of a man who has just understood something he should have understood a day ago. "He's not going to come at me next. He's going to come at her." "How?" Alderton asked. "Her reputation," Abigail said. Both men looked at her. She had thought about this. She had thought about it since the day she walked out of that meeting room, and she had filed it in the part of her mind where she kept the things she was monitoring without yet alarming anyone about. "A woman who interferes in her husband's business affairs," she said evenly. "Who goes through his private documents. Who engages outside solicitors without her husband's knowledge. Who presents herself in formal commercial meetings as though she has authority she wasn't granted." She looked at Alderton. It wouldn't be difficult to construct a narrative around that, particularly if the men doing the constructing have social influence and the woman has no public standing of her own. Alderton was quiet for a moment. "He'd have to act quickly," he said, "before our case is filed, which means we have to act more quickly," Abigail said. She turned to Benjamin. "The Morton contact," she said. "Tomorrow, first thing." He was already standing. "I'll go myself," he said. "Tonight if his household will receive me." Benjamin left within the hour. Alderton stayed to organize the documents, creating a working copy of everything that could be taken to his office for safe storage, because having the only copies of all this evidence in one location had just become a risk none of them were willing to accept. While he worked, he and Abigail talked. Not about the case specifically. Alderton was efficient and methodical, and the work was its own conversation. They talked about the nature of these schemes, about why they worked as often as they did, about what allowed a man like Whitmore to operate across multiple targets over multiple years without being stopped. "Pride," Abigail said. "The men he targets are too proud to be helped by someone they've decided can't help them." Alderton looked up from his organizing. "Your husband listened," he said. "Eventually," she said. "That's more than Grenville did by the account in your letter." "Yes," she said. "It is." Alderton was quiet for a moment. "You know," he said, "I've seen cases where wives found things their husbands missed. It's not uncommon. The difference is usually whether the wife has the training to know what she's found." He picked up another stack of pages. "Your father taught you well." "He treated me like I was capable," Abigail said. "That was most of it." She heard as she said the particular weight of the words. What she had learned from her father, she had carried into this marriage and applied consistently and largely invisibly to the benefit of an estate that had never formally acknowledged her contribution. That was going to change. She didn't know exactly when or how, but it was going to change. Benjamin returned at 11:30. He came into the study with an expression Abigail had not seen on his face before, not in 2 years of marriage, not in any of the conversations of the past week. It was the expression of a man who had just had a conversation that confirmed from the outside everything his wife had told him was true. Morton's agent, he said. His name is Fletcher. He was willing to talk. He sat down. His hands were flat on the table. Whitmore's man approached Morton Brokerage 14 months ago. Retainer paid quarterly in exchange for Morton declining to renew specific cargo agreements with Ashford Estate. The instructions were framed as a managed reduction, nothing dramatic, nothing that would be visible as deliberate interference. Just consistent, quiet unavailability. Did Fletcher know why? Alderton asked. He suspected. He didn't ask. But he was uncomfortable enough that he kept records. Benjamin looked at Abigail. He has receipts. Quarterly payments from an account traced to... He paused. Meridian Holdings. The same account. He'll testify, Alderton asked. He will. He said... Benjamin stopped for a moment. He said he'd been looking for a reason to come forward for a year. He said he didn't know how to start without evidence that it would matter. He looked at his hands. He didn't think anyone had enough to make it matter. They do now, Alderton said. The three of them sat with the weight of that for a moment. It was complete. Not filed, not public, not finished, but complete in the way that a case is complete, when every element has been identified and every source has been secured. What came next was process. Important, careful, consequential process, but the architecture was finished. Abigail had built it. She had built it in the mornings before Benjamin came downstairs, and in the evenings after he went to his study, and in the quiet hours of nights when this house had been entirely silent, and she had sat alone with her notebook and her father's methods, and the steady, patient conviction that the truth, if pursued carefully enough, would eventually become impossible to ignore. Alderton left just after midnight, carrying copies of every document they'd assembled. Benjamin walked him out. When he came back, he stood in the doorway of the study for a moment, looking at Abigail, who was still at the table with her notebook open. "You should sleep," he said. "I want to write the summary while everything is clear," she said. He came and sat down across from her. She kept writing. He didn't leave. After a while he said, "When Alderton asked how you learned contract analysis," she kept writing. "Yes, your father." He paused. "You've never told me much about him." "You've never asked," she said simply. Not as accusation, as fact. He absorbed that. "I'm asking now," he said. She stopped writing. She looked at her husband across the table, at the man she had married and defended and quietly served and been hurt by the man who had called her a burden and was now sitting in his study at midnight asking about her father, because he was finally genuinely trying to understand who she was. She set her pen down. She told him. She told him about her father's counting house, about the ledgers she'd learned to read before she could fully read novels, about the way her father had sat with her at his desk on Saturday mornings and walked her through accounts the way other fathers walked sons through estates. About the patience he'd given her that no school would have. About what it had felt like at 15 to understand something complex and have someone look at her understanding with respect rather than surprise. Benjamin listened. He asked questions, real ones. Outside, the night had gone fully quiet. The house was still. The documents that would dismantle Thomas Whitmore's empire were safely in a solicitor's briefcase on their way to the city. The Morton agent's testimony was secured. The financial evidence was documented and copied. And two people who had been strangers in the same house for 2 years were for the first time genuinely talking. It was not enough. Abigail knew that. One night of conversation did not repair 2 years of dismissal. One crisis survived together did not constitute a marriage. She was not a woman who confused a good moment for a resolved situation. But it was a beginning. And the beginning had teeth. Because tomorrow, Thomas Whitmore was going to discover that the woman he'd smiled past at dinner had spent 6 weeks building a case that would end him, and he was going to have absolutely no way to stop it. Thomas Whitmore moved on a Friday. Abigail had predicted he would move quickly. She had not predicted how quickly or through which door. She found out, the way she found out most things that happened in the world of men, not through direct communication, but through the side channel of a conversation she was not supposed to hear. She had come downstairs early before breakfast, intending to review the summary she'd written the night before. The study door was ajar, and Benjamin was already inside, speaking in a low, taut voice to someone Abigail didn't recognize. She stopped outside the door. "He's filed a formal complaint," the unfamiliar voice said, "with the commercial registry, against Ashford Estate." "On what grounds?" Benjamin's voice was controlled, but only just. "Breach of preliminary agreement. He's claiming that the series of account payments, the consulting fees, constitute a binding preliminary commitment to the Hartfield arrangement. He's arguing that Ashford Estate entered into an implied contract and then withdrew without legal basis." Abigail's hand tightened on her portfolio. He had moved first. He had taken the very evidence of his own fraud, the payments his man Henson had inserted into the Ashford accounts, and reframed them as proof of Benjamin's obligation. The audacity of it was staggering. He had stolen money from the estate, used it to manufacture a false financial relationship, and was now pointing to that manufactured relationship as the legal foundation of a claim against the man he had stolen from. "When was this filed?" Benjamin asked. "Yesterday morning," the voice said. "First thing, one day after Alderton left with their documents." Whitmore had known they were building a case, or suspected it, and he had moved to establish a legal position before they could file anything of their own. If Ashford Estate was on the defensive with an active complaint against it, any counterclaim would take longer to be heard, would be received in a different context, would be seen through the distorting lens of the complaint's prior claim on public record. Abigail pushed the door open and walked in. Both men looked at her. The unfamiliar man was young, a clerk of some kind, she thought, or a junior agent, and he had the startled expression of someone who hadn't expected a woman to enter at that velocity and with that expression. "He filed yesterday morning," she said, "which means he knew about Alderton before Alderton reached the city." Benjamin looked at her steadily. "That's what I'm thinking," he said. "He has a contact in the city," she said. "Someone who saw Alderton collecting documents, or who monitored his movements. Or—" She stopped. "Or someone in this house." The young clerk looked at Benjamin. Benjamin looked at Abigail. "Henson," she said. "You said his access to the accounts was never formally revoked. If Henson still has any line of communication with the counting house, with Harris, with anyone in the estate administration, Whitmore would have known Alderton was here within hours of his arrival." "Harris wouldn't," Benjamin began. "Not Harris deliberately," Abigail said. "But if Henson is still listed as an authorized correspondent with the counting house, any communication that passed through that channel in the last week could have been visible to him. Routine correspondence, staff messages, even Alderton's name on a visitor record." She crossed to the desk. "We need to know exactly what Henson can still see, and we need to close every access point today." Benjamin turned to the clerk. "Get me Harris, now." The young man left at speed. Benjamin looked at Abigail. "He's 2 moves ahead." "He was 2 moves ahead yesterday," she said. "We need to be 4 ahead by this afternoon." She opened her portfolio on the desk and pulled out the summary she'd written after midnight. "Alderton needs to know about the complaint immediately. If he files our counterclaim before the registry processes Whitmore's filing, we establish priority. The question is whether he can file today." "It's Friday," Benjamin said. "I know it's Friday." She was already pulling out a sheet of paper. "Write to Alderton, now. I'll compose it while you seal the Henson access. We need both things done within the hour." Benjamin didn't argue. That, more than anything that had happened in the past week, told Abigail how much the ground had shifted between them. 2 weeks ago, Benjamin Ashford did not take direction from his wife. He did not defer to her assessments or act on her urgency. He managed. He decided. He proceeded at his own pace. Now he picked up his pen. Harris arrived within 15 minutes. He was a solid, careful man of 55 who had managed the Ashford Estate operations for 12 years, and whose principal quality besides competence was a genuine and unperformable discomfort with anything that smelled of dishonesty. When Benjamin explained what Henson had done, the access, the payments, the manufactured entries, Harris's face went through a sequence that Abigail watched with attention, disbelief, then painful recognition, then the tight-jawed expression of a man who was realizing that something had happened under his watch that he hadn't caught. "The quarterly journals," Harris said. They're reconciled by the city counting house. I review the summaries. But the original entries... He stopped. A correspondent with authorized access could introduce entries before reconciliation. I'd see the figure in the summary, but not the source notation, unless I specifically requested the original ledger. Did you request originals recently? Abigail asked. Not for the past year, Harris said. There was no reason to. The figures reconciled. They reconciled because they were designed to, she said. The amounts were small enough to absorb into normal operating variation. The source notations were written in standard format, so they'd pass summary review. She looked at Harris directly. This is not your failure, Mr. Harris. This was constructed specifically to avoid detection by a careful man. Harris looked at her. He had the expression of someone receiving something unexpected and not quite knowing where to put it. What do you need from me? He asked. Every communication that has passed through the counting house in the last 2 weeks, she said. Any notation of external correspondence, any inquiry about estate operations from any party not specifically authorized by Mr. Ashford. I need to know exactly what Whitmore's people have been able to see and when. Harris nodded once. I can have that within 2 hours. 1 hour would be better, she said. He left at the same pace the clerk had. Benjamin sealed the letter to Alderton. He looked at Abigail across the desk at the woman who was running the defense of his estate with the precise, rapid efficiency of a general who had been preparing for this battle before the other side had even declared war. If Alderton can file today, Benjamin said, what does that do? It establishes our counterclaim on record before the weekend, she said. Whitmore's filing goes into the registry queue and sits over the weekend without action. Our filing goes in alongside it. When the registry opens Monday, both filings are visible simultaneously. Neither has priority of processing, but we have documentation that his filing cannot match. She closed the portfolio. He's making a legal argument from false evidence. We're making a legal argument from documented fact. As long as both are on record, ours wins. Unless, Benjamin said slowly, he moves to suppress our documentation before Monday. She had thought about that too. Which is why Alderton's copies cannot be in only one location over the weekend, she said. I've already drafted a note to Edmund Farrow asking him to hold a second set. And there's one more thing. She reached into her portfolio and pulled out a letter. Already written, already addressed. Catherine Hale, Benjamin said, reading the name on the envelope. She's in Bath, Abigail said. She's a witness to Whitmore's previous pattern. Her account combined with everything we have on the Grenville case constitutes prior conduct evidence. That's significant. She paused. But she's also vulnerable. If Whitmore learns she spoke to me, he may try to pressure her through social channels, through her current husband, through their standing in Bath society. I want her to know that we are filing that she has protection in numbers, and that her testimony is not the only pillar of this case. Benjamin looked at the letter. You've been thinking about her safety. She tried to stop this once, Abigail said quietly. She deserves to know it's being stopped now. He nodded. Send it, he said. Alderton's response came at 10:30. Not a letter. Alderton himself arriving on horseback with the compact urgency of a man who had read the note and made an immediate decision. He came into the study still removing his gloves, and the first thing he said was, We file this afternoon. I've already drafted the primary complaint. I need 2 hours with these documents, and then I go directly to the registry. Whitmore's filing, Abigail began. I saw it this morning, Alderton said. He's using the Meridian payments as proof of prior commitment. It's aggressive and it's clever, and it would work against someone who didn't have the countervailing evidence. He placed his briefcase on the desk and opened it. We have the countervailing evidence. We also... He pulled out a sheet. Have something I found last night. He placed it on the desk. It was a corporate filing, a legal record of company formation. Meridian Holdings, he said. I traced the full corporate registry chain last night, through 4 subsidiary layers. His finger moved to a name at the bottom of the chain. The ultimate beneficial owner. Benjamin leaned forward. Abigail read the name. Francis Henson. Not Whitmore. Not a Whitmore associate. Henson, the same man. Whitmore had inserted into Ashford Estates Financial Administration was listed as the beneficial owner of Meridian Holdings. He distanced himself one layer further than I expected, Alderton said. Whitmore doesn't appear on any Meridian document. Legally, his fingerprints aren't on the extraction directly, only on the broker arrangements and the contract structure. He paused. But Henson is his man. We can establish that relationship through the Morton payments, which do trace back to a Whitmore account. The chain is intact, it's just longer than we thought. Does this weaken the case? Benjamin asked. No, Abigail said before Alderton could answer. Both men looked at her. It strengthens it, she said, because it demonstrates premeditation. Whitmore didn't just design a predatory contract. He created a separate legal entity, installed a proxy, and used that proxy to access and manipulate a target's financial records in advance. That's not opportunism. That's a systematic criminal operation. She looked at Alderton. Can you include the Henson corporate chain in this afternoon's filing? It's already in the draft, Alderton said. She almost smiled. She didn't, there was too much still to do, but she felt it. Harris returned at 11 with the counting house communications record. What he found was worse than Abigail had projected, and better than she'd feared. Worse because Henson had indeed remained an active correspondent with the counting house, receiving routine, summary documents as recently as 8 days ago, which meant he'd had access to the Ashford financial picture through the entire period of Alderton's investigation. Better because the communications were logged. Every one. Dates, times, recipient notations, a complete record of exactly what Henson had received and when. It was evidence of the ongoing access. It was also evidence that Whitmore had known what they were building in real time as they built it. He knew we were assembling a case, Abigail told Alderton. He saw Alderton's activity, understood what it meant, and filed preemptively to try to establish legal priority before we could. Which means, Alderton said, he's afraid. The word landed in the room with a particular weight. Thomas Whitmore, who had operated across multiple targets, across multiple years with complete impunity, who had dismantled the Grenville estate, and God knew how many others without ever appearing on a single legal document of consequence, was afraid of Abigail Mercer Ashford and the notebook she kept in her locked writing desk drawer. File this afternoon, Benjamin said. It was not a question. Alderton closed his briefcase. I leave within the hour. Howe was gone by noon. The house was quiet in a way that felt like held breath. Benjamin paced not anxiously, but with the focused physical energy of a man who had been sitting with tension for a week and had no useful outlet for it, now that the immediate action had been taken and the next phase was in Alderton's hands. Abigail made tea. She brought it to the study and set it on the desk, and Benjamin looked at it with a briefly startled expression, as though the simplicity of the gesture was somehow unexpected in the middle of everything. Sit down, she said. There's nothing more to do until Monday. He sat. They drank their tea in silence for a while. Not the uncomfortable silences of the past 2 years. The silences of two people who had run out of things to say to each other that were safe. This was the silence of two people who were tired and had done everything they could and were simply occupying the same space without needing to perform. After a while, Benjamin said, I owe you more than an apology. She held her cup and looked at him. I said it the other day, he continued, that I owed you an apology, and I meant it, but I've been sitting with it since then, and I think apology is insufficient for what I actually did. He set his cup down. I dismissed you in public. I used the word... He stopped, restarted. I used the word burden, in my own house to my own valet, about my wife. His voice had a roughness to it she hadn't heard before. Not emotion exactly, or not only emotion, but the specific discomfort of a proud man stating clearly what he did. And the particular cruelty of it, Abigail, is that you heard me. I didn't know you heard me, but you did. She held his gaze. I did, she said. And then you went and spent a week saving my estate anyway. I went and spent a week saving our estate, she said. This is my home too. The distinction was small. The weight of it was not. Benjamin looked at his hands. The hands that had signed 100 agreements, built a network of relationships across half of England, maintained the Ashford name with the kind of discipline that came from genuinely caring about what it stood for. "My father told me once," he said slowly, "that the measure of a man was not what he accomplished, but what he protected. He meant the land, the tenants, the name." He paused. "I think he was right, but I understood it too narrowly. I thought protection meant strength, authority, control." Another pause. "I didn't understand that protection can also look like a woman sitting at her writing desk at 2 in the morning, reading a contract her husband dismissed." Abigail was quiet for a moment. "Benjamin," she said, "what you said about me to Perkins, I won't tell you, it didn't hurt. It did. It hurt considerably. Not because I was surprised exactly, but because I had hoped you thought better of me than that even privately." She held his gaze. "I have worked for 2 years inside this marriage as though I were invisible. Quietly, efficiently, and without acknowledgement. Not because I needed acknowledgement as a performance. I don't need applause. But because the invisibility wasn't neutral. It was a message. And the message was that I didn't count." He didn't look away. "You counted," he said. "I simply failed to count you." She absorbed that. It was precisely said, the kind of precise admission that a man of Benjamin's particular intelligence arrived at when he chose to be honest rather than defensive. "Then change that," she said simply. "I intend to," he said. Saturday passed. Sunday was the longest day Abigail could remember in recent history, longer even than the days of waiting for Edmund Farrow's reply, or the night before the meeting with Whitmore. Because now everything was filed and recorded, and in the hands of the legal process, and there was nothing left to do but wait for Monday and the registry and whatever Thomas Whitmore intended to do next. She went to church with Benjamin in the morning, which was their usual Sunday practice, and stood beside him in the pew, while the sermon moved over her like water. Her mind elsewhere, entirely running through possibilities and contingencies, the way it had been running for 2 weeks without fully stopping. She noticed as they walked back from the church that Benjamin's hand found hers. Not dramatically. Not with announcement. He simply adjusted his pace to walk beside her instead of slightly ahead, which was his habitual position. She realized just that half-step lead that said without words that he was the one setting the direction, and his hand found hers as naturally as though it had always been there. She didn't comment on it. She held it. They walked the rest of the way home without speaking, and it was the most comfortable silence she had experienced with this man in the entirety of their marriage. Monday came. Alderton sent a message by 7 in the morning. Brief, precise, the communication style of a man who understood that in moments of high consequence, words should carry weight rather than volume. The registry had received both filings. The Ashford counterclaim had been catalogued with full documentary evidence attached. The presiding officer assigned to review preliminary matters would begin formal assessment on Wednesday. Alderton also included one line at the bottom of the note that Abigail read twice. Whitmore's solicitor Carver had submitted a withdrawal request for the original complaint. Abigail brought the note to Benjamin. He read it. His expression didn't change immediately. Then slowly something moved across his face. Not triumph. Nothing so clean as that, but the specific relief of a man who has been holding something very heavy and has just been told he can set it down. "He's withdrawing," Benjamin said. "He knows we have the full chain," Abigail said. "Once our filing was on record, the corporate chain, the broker payments, the Henson connection. The Grenville precedent pressing his complaint forward would require him to argue in a public legal forum against evidence that exposes the entire operation. He can't do that without destroying himself. So he walks away. He walks away from this," she said. "The registry still has our filing. The documented fraud doesn't disappear because he withdrew the complaint. Our counterclaim stands on its own. Alderton said he's pursuing it as an independent matter." Benjamin set the note down. "He'll face consequences," he said. "He will," she said. "Not immediately, perhaps. These things take time. But the documentation is on record, the broker testimony is secured, and Carver is named in the Grenville materials. The structure has been exposed." She paused. Other people he's targeted will have the opportunity to come forward now that there is a public record. Catherine Grenville. Catherine Hale may not be the only one. You wrote to her, Benjamin said. She wrote back yesterday, Abigail said. She was relieved. I think that's the word. She said she had been living with the knowledge of what he'd done for 4 years and carrying it alone. She paused. She said she was glad someone else had been listening. Benjamin looked at her for a long moment. You thought about her safety from the beginning, he said. Not just the case, her. She tried to do what I was trying to do, Abigail said. The difference between us was that her husband didn't listen, and mine eventually did. The word eventually hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. Benjamin accepted it. Abigail. He said her name with the same quality he'd used that evening in her morning room, not as preamble, just as itself. I want to ask you something. She waited. I want to change the estate administration, he said. Formally. The accounts, the commercial agreements, the supplier relationships. I want you to have formal authority over these matters, not advisory. Formal. He held her gaze. As a co-administrator of Ashford Estate. She was very still. That's not customary, she said carefully. I'm aware. It will attract comment. The men you work with, let them comment, he said. I've spent 2 years surrounded by men who told me implicitly and explicitly that my wife's intelligence was a social inconvenience. Meanwhile, my wife's intelligence was the only thing standing between my estate and complete destruction. He kept his eyes on hers. I'm not interested in the opinion of men who cannot read a contract. Abigail felt something move in her chest. Not the cautious, careful thing she'd learned to keep there over 2 years of being dismissed, but something older and more fundamental. The part of her that had sat at her father's desk at 15 and understood numbers with a precision that had always been real, always been valuable, always been hers. I would need access to all estate correspondence, she said. You'll have it. And the counting house relationship needs to be restructured, she said. New protocols, new authorization chains. You'll design them, he said. Harris will implement whatever you determine. She looked at him for a long moment. You're not doing this out of guilt, she said. It was not a question, but it needed to be spoken. I'm doing this because it's the correct decision for the estate, he said. And because it is long overdue. A pause. The guilt is also present, but it's not the reason. She believed him. She had learned in 2 years with this man to distinguish between the things he said because they were expected and the things he said because they were true. Benjamin Ashford, for all his failures and all the ways his pride had blinded him, was not a man who lied. He might dismiss, might ignore, might fail to see, but he did not say things he didn't mean. All right, she said. All right, he said, as though he'd expected more conditions, more negotiation. All right, she said again. But I want something else as well. He looked at her. I want you to write to Arthur Grenville, she said. Whatever remains of his situation, whatever assets or reputation can be restored even partially, I want you to support that effort. Not publicly, if he prefers privacy, but materially. She held his gaze. We were almost him. The least we can do is not leave him entirely alone in it. Benjamin was quiet for 3 seconds. I'll write today, he said. Good. She picked up her tea. He picked up his. Outside, the estate was doing what estates do, the ground staff moving through their morning routines, the kitchen already busy, the whole ordinary machinery of a life turning forward. The same estate it had been a week ago, and entirely different. Harris knocked at 11 to ask about the quarterly supplier review. Benjamin told him to bring the materials and that Mrs. Ashford would be reviewing them as well. Harris looked at Abigail. He didn't look surprised. He looked, if anything, like a man whose long-held suspicion had been confirmed. Very good, he said simply, and went to get the materials. Abigail opened her notebook to a fresh page. At the top she wrote Ashford Estate New Protocols, and she began. The new protocols took Abigail 3 days to design and another 2 to implement. She did not do it dramatically. She did not arrive at the counting house with announcements or declarations. She arrived with her notebook and her portfolio and sat down with the head clerk, a careful, precise man named Ogilvy, who had been maintaining the Ashford accounts for 8 years and went through every authorization chain, every correspondent access point, every reconciliation procedure that had allowed Henson's insertions to pass undetected. Ogilvy was initially wary. She could see it in the careful neutrality of his expression, the way he responded to her questions, with minimal elaboration, offering information when directly asked, but volunteering nothing. He was not hostile. He was watchful. He was a man waiting to understand what kind of authority this woman actually had before he decided how to treat it. On the second day, she found a discrepancy he had missed. Not a fraudulent one, a simple reconciliation error that had been compounding quietly for 4 months and would, left unaddressed, have created a significant accounting problem by year's end. She showed it to him without drama, walking him through the calculation in the same patient way her father had walked her through his ledgers at 15. Ogilvy looked at the figures. He checked them. He looked at Abigail. "I've been reconciling these quarterly for 3 years," he said. "I know," she said. "The error was introduced in a batch update last spring. It wouldn't have been visible in standard quarterly review." He was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to a fresh page in his working ledger and said, "How would you like me to correct it?" That was the moment the wariness left his face. He answered her questions fully after that. He explained systems she hadn't asked about because she hadn't known they existed. He flagged 3 other areas of the accounts that had always seemed slightly unclear to him, and that he'd never had occasion to formally raise with Mr. Ashford, because they were small, and the process for raising them was cumbersome. They were small. But small things, Abigail had always known, were where the large problems hid. By Friday, the new authorization protocols were in place. Every external correspondent access had been formally reviewed, documented, and either confirmed or revoked. Henson's access, all of it through every channel, had been closed and recorded in a manner that Alderton confirmed was legally useful. The reconciliation process now required a second verification step that would make the kind of insertion Henson had managed essentially impossible without detection. Abigail wrote a summary of every change and gave it to Benjamin. He read it that evening. When he finished, he looked at her across the study table. "This is thorough," he said. "It needed to be," she said. "How long did this take you?" 5 days, she said, though some of the thinking had been accumulating longer. Benjamin set the summary down. "Ogilvy wrote to me," he said. "Separately. He said—" He paused, and something in his expression shifted, not quite amusement, not quite wonder, something between the two. He said that working with Mrs. Ashford had been the most clarifying professional experience of his recent career. Abigail looked at the table. "He's a good clerk," she said. "He just needed someone to think alongside." "Most people do," Benjamin said quietly. I was looking at her when he said it, and they both understood he wasn't talking about Ogilvy. The letter from Alderton arrived the following Tuesday. Abigail read it standing at her writing desk, still in her morning coat, and she had to read the first paragraph twice before the full weight of it landed. The registry had completed its preliminary review of both filings. Whitmore's withdrawal had been accepted, which formally ended the original complaint. But Alderton's independent filing, the Ashford counterclaim, framed as an independent fraud complaint, rather than a defensive response, had been assigned to a full reviewing officer. The evidence package was in the officer's preliminary assessment, sufficient to warrant a formal investigation. Alderton's note at the bottom was brief. "This is the outcome we needed. The investigation will take months, but it is begun." She went directly to Benjamin's study. He read the letter. He read it again. Then he set it on the desk and was quiet for a long moment. "It's begun," he said. "Yes," she said. "And the others," he said slowly. "The families he's done this to before. Grenville, whoever else there are. Alderton has already been in contact with 2 other families," she said. "Quietly, through channels that won't alarm Whitmore before the investigation is formalized. Both have indicated they may have relevant information." She paused. "It's possible there are more. The investigation will find them." Benjamin stood and moved to the window. His habitual thinking position, which she had come to understand was not avoidance, but concentration. He stood there for a moment with his hands at his sides. "Catherine Hale," he said. "She'll be called as a witness, presumably. She wrote to me again yesterday," Abigail said. "She's willing," she said. She paused, feeling the weight of the words before she repeated them. She said that when she tried to stop it 4 years ago, she felt entirely alone. She said, knowing there's documentation this time, knowing it's real and it's public, she said it changes something. She stopped. She said she could sleep again. Benjamin turned from the window. He looked at his wife. He looked at the woman who had come into his house 2 years ago with a merchant's daughter's spine and a bookkeeper's daughter's mind, and whom he had proceeded systematically and without malice, but with devastating consistency, to treat as furniture. Who had responded to that treatment not by diminishing herself, but by working quietly and alone, and without recognition, to protect everything he'd built while he was busy failing to see her. Abigail, he said, "I need to tell you something." She waited. "I've been thinking about what you said. About invisibility. About how the invisibility was a message." He came away from the window and stood across the desk from her. "I want you to understand, and I know understanding doesn't undo anything. I'm not offering it as repair, but I want you to understand that my failure to see you was not because what you had to offer was insufficient. It was because I had decided before I ever actually looked that it would be." He held her gaze. "That is a different kind of failure. Worse in some ways than if I had looked and found you wanting. I didn't look at all." The room was very still. Abigail held his gaze for a long moment. "I know," she said. That's what made it so hard to keep trying. But you kept trying." "I kept trying," she agreed. "Because this is my home, and because I am not someone who stops when the work is still necessary." A pause. "And because Benjamin and I want to be honest with you about this, I did not stop hoping that you would eventually look." He absorbed that. "And now?" he asked. She considered the question with the care it deserved. "Now," she said, "I think you are beginning to look, and I think what you see is probably surprising you." Something moved across his face, quick and unguarded, the expression of a man who has been found out in the most gentling possible way. "Yes," he said quietly. "It is." 3 weeks after Alderton's letter. Something happened that Abigail had not planned for and could not have anticipated, and it changed the final shape of everything. A visitor arrived at Ashford Estate on a Wednesday afternoon. Not Alderton, not Farrow, not anyone connected to the legal process. Lord Edward Cavendish. He was 60 years old, a peer of considerable standing, and he had not sent advance notice. His card was brought to the study where Abigail and Benjamin were reviewing the quarterly grain contracts, and Benjamin looked at it with the brief frown of a man trying to place the connection. "Cavendish," he said. "I know him slightly. We were introduced at Parliament 2 years ago. He has estates in Lincolnshire." He set the card down. "I have no idea why he's here." "Then let's find out," Abigail said. They received him together, which was no longer unusual in Ashford Estate, though it had been 2 weeks ago, and the fact that it was no longer unusual was itself a measure of how much had quietly changed. Cavendish was a tall man with the bearing of someone who had never in his life been uncertain about his right to occupy a room. But he came in without the easy authority of a social call. There was something careful about him, something that Abigail read immediately as purposeful. He accepted tea. He made 3 sentences of pleasantry. Then he set his cup down and said with the directness of a man who has decided that the fastest route is also the most dignified, "I understand you have filed a complaint against Thomas Whitmore." Benjamin's expression steadied. "That matter is with the registry," he said carefully. "It is," Cavendish said. "I am aware because my own solicitor was contacted by the reviewing officer last week as part of the preliminary investigation." He paused. "Whitmore attempted the same arrangement with my family 18 months ago. The proposal was declined at the outset because my estate manager, a particularly cautious man, identified language in the preliminary terms that he found unusual." He looked at Benjamin. "At the time I was simply relieved to have avoided a poor agreement." I did not understand the full structure of what was being attempted. And now, Abigail said. Cavendish turned to her. His gaze was direct and entirely without condescension. The gaze of a man who had been briefed on what she had done and had decided how to receive that information. Now, he said, I understand that what my estate manager flagged as unusual language was the same navigational rights reversal clause your complaint describes, and I understand that I declined something that at least 3 other families did not. He set his hands flat on his knees. I would like to provide a statement to the investigation. What I know about the preliminary approach Whitmore made to my family, the timing, the structure, the individuals involved may be useful as evidence of a systematic pattern. Benjamin looked at Abigail. She was already thinking through the implications. Cavendish's standing was significant. A peer of his rank providing a voluntary statement to the investigation would transform its public weight entirely. Not just a complaint from a commercial landowner, but testimony from a member of the nobility who had been targeted by the same method. Your estate manager, she said. The one who identified the unusual language. Is he willing to speak to our solicitor? Hayes Cavendish said. He is in fact rather eager to. He's been troubled for 18 months that his concern was never formally recorded anywhere. Abigail turned to Benjamin. He gave her the smallest nod, not deferring to her, but acknowledging that she had already seen what he was seeing. I'll write to Alderton today, she said. He'll want to meet with you as soon as possible. Cavendish inclined his head. Then he looked at Abigail with the particular expression of a man who has something additional to say and is deciding how to say it. Mrs. Ashford, he said, I was told by the reviewing officer who mentioned it in passing that the evidence package submitted with your filing was the most comprehensively organized private submission he had seen in his tenure. He paused. He was curious about its authorship. It was a collaborative effort, Abigail said. That is what your solicitor told him as well. Cavendish looked at her steadily. It is also apparently not entirely accurate. She held his gaze without flinching. The organization was mine, she said. The legal filing was Alderton's. The testimony came from multiple sources. A case is built from many hands. Indeed it is, Cavendish said. But the architecture, the recognition of the pattern across multiple targets, the identification of the broker arrangement, the tracing of the corporate chain, that is a particular kind of thinking. Not common. He paused. Not common at all. The room was quiet. Benjamin, who had been listening to this exchange with the stillness of a man watching something important, spoke. No, he said. It is not common. I was fortunate enough to be married to it without knowing it for 2 years. He looked at Abigail. I know it now. Cavendish looked between them with the expression of a man who has walked into a room and discovered a conversation considerably more significant than the one he'd planned to have. Well, he said after a moment. Then Whitmore made the same mistake with you that he made with all of them. He looked at the room and decided who mattered. He did, Abigail said, and he was wrong. Catastrophically, she said. Cavendish's statement was submitted to the investigation within the week. 2 days after that, a 4th family came forward, the Marshfields, whose commercial shipping operation in the East had suffered what they had believed to be an unexplained market decline 3 years ago. The decline had never been explained to their satisfaction, but they had absorbed it as loss and moved on because there was nothing to point to and no mechanism for complaint. The investigation gave them the mechanism. They provided financial records going back 4 years. That when Alderton cross-referenced them against the broker payment chains showed the same pattern of manufactured shortfall. Whitmore's solicitor Carver resigned from practice the same week. He cited health concerns. No one who understood what was happening believed him. Francis Henson was identified, formally interviewed, and promptly retained his own counsel, which was, Alderton told Benjamin, the behavior of a man who understood that cooperation was his most viable remaining option. Edmund Farrow wrote to Abigail with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had spent 40 years watching careful work go unrecognized, and was pleased to see this particular instance receive its due. Catherine Hale. Catherine Grenville wrote twice. The second letter was longer than the first. She was beginning, she said, to believe that what had happened to her family might be recoverable after all. Not financially, the Grenville assets were gone, and she harbored no illusions about that. But in some other way that she was finding difficult to name. She said she had been holding the weight of it alone for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to set some of it down. She thanked Abigail. She said she hoped they might meet someday, because she had never had the opportunity to thank someone in person for doing something she had tried and failed to do herself. Abigail wrote back immediately. She invited Catherine to Ashford Estate. Then she went to find Benjamin and told him she'd done it. He didn't hesitate. "When is she coming?" he asked. "Next month," Abigail said. "Good," he said. "I'll write to Arthur Grenville's solicitor again. I want to make certain the financial assistance we discussed is in place before she arrives, so she knows when she comes that it isn't only words." Abigail looked at her husband, at the man who had sat at the head of a glittering dinner table and told the room with the casual confidence of someone who has never had to think about the weight of his words that his wife didn't understand business. Who had spoken in the dark to his valet about the mistake of marrying a woman who was kind but couldn't build an estate. Who had reduced the most capable person in his household to a category burden because categories were easier than actually looking, and who was now with the same unsentimental practicality that characterized everything he did, making certain that a woman he'd never met would arrive at his home to find that the promise of restoration was already more than a gesture. "Benjamin," she said. He looked at her. "You are becoming someone I am glad I stayed for," she said. It was not a small thing to say. Both of them knew it. She had stayed in the hard years, the invisible years, the years of dismissed concerns and dinner-table humiliations, and nights lying in the dark, absorbing words that had not been meant for her ears. She had stayed and worked and protected and built, and she was telling him plainly that the staying had not been without cost, and that what he was becoming now, this man choosing differently daily in the concrete and unsentimental language of actions, was earning something real. He held her gaze. "I am trying," he said, "to be someone worth staying for." "I know," she said. "I can see it." 6 months after Thomas Whitmore filed a complaint he believed would silence an inconvenient woman, the investigation concluded its formal proceedings. The findings were comprehensive. 7 families had been identified as targets. 5 had been successfully defrauded over a period spanning 11 years. The broker arrangement. Whitmore's mechanism for manufacturing the conditions that made the contract thresholds impossible to meet had involved 4 separate brokerage houses and 16 individual transactions. The total value extracted through the scheme exceeded £40,000. Whitmore's legal team negotiated a settlement rather than face a public criminal trial. The terms required full disclosure of assets, restitution to the affected families on a schedule determined by the investigating officer, and a permanent bar from commercial practice in England. It was not a prison sentence. Abigail had understood it might not be. Men of Whitmore's standing with resources sufficient to hire adequate legal protection and the social architecture to weather a settlement differently from how an ordinary man would weather it. These men rarely ended in prison. The law had a different texture at that altitude, but his empire was finished. His reputation was in ruins. The name Whitmore, which had commanded deference in dining rooms across England for 2 decades, now preceded him as a warning rather than an introduction. And the families, he had broken the Grenvilles, the Marshfields, the others had legal standing documented, restitution, and something arguably more valuable than money, a public record of what had happened to them. The record said, "This was not your failure. This was done to you deliberately and systematically by a man who made a career of targeting people he believed were too proud or too distracted or too dismissive of the wrong person to notice." Catherine Hale came to Ashford Estate in October. She arrived in the late morning, and Abigail met her at the door, not in the grand formal manner of a receiving line, but simply standing there when the carriage arrived, because the occasion did not require ceremony, and Abigail had never been a woman who needed it. Catherine was 43. She had her husband's name now Hale, and the careful posture of someone who had learned to move through the world at a lower profile than she'd been born to. But when she stepped out of the carriage and saw Abigail, something in her face changed. The careful neutrality dropped away, and what was underneath it was simply a woman who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and was finally, for the first time in years, in a room where she didn't have to pretend she wasn't. They embraced before either of them said a word. It was not the embrace of strangers meeting for the first time. It was the embrace of two women who had done the same thing in different circumstances and understood without having to explain it what that meant. Benjamin greeted Catherine with a formality that was genuine rather than performative, the formal courtesy of a man who understood the specific kind of debt his house owed to hers, even if the mechanism of that debt was complicated. At lunch, he said, "Mrs. Hale, I want to say, and I want to say it plainly, not with any kind of diplomatic softening, that the outcome we arrived at would not have been possible without what you told Abigail about Gerald Mott and the broker arrangement. The entire mechanism of the fraud was invisible until you gave us the key to it." He paused. "I am sorry that key cost you what it did." Catherine looked at him for a moment. "Mr. Ashford," she said carefully, "I tried to give that key to my husband 4 years ago. He didn't take it." A pause. "You did." "Eventually," he said with the same honest qualifier Abigail had used weeks ago, accepting it as the accurate word. "Eventually is better than never," Catherine said simply. Abigail listened to this exchange across the table and thought about the distance between those two words, eventually and never, and what it meant that the distance between them had been traveled not by Benjamin of his own initiative, not by the pressure of social expectation or legal necessity, but by the steady, patient, unrelenting work of a woman who had refused to accept that being dismissed meant being wrong. That evening, after Catherine had retired and the house had gone quiet, Abigail sat in her morning room. The room. Benjamin had always called her morning room, as though she only existed in it at one time of day, with her notebook open on the desk. She had been writing something. Not accounts, not protocols, not case notes. She had been writing in the small, precise handwriting her father had taught her, something that had been accumulating in her for weeks since the investigation concluded and the settlement was announced, and she'd found herself standing in the quiet aftermath of everything she'd built, looking at what it had cost and what it had produced. Benjamin knocked and came in. She heard him cross the room and sit in the chair across from her, the chair that had become in recent months a place where things were actually said between them. "You're still writing," he said. "I'm almost done," she said. She wrote the last line, set down her pen. "May I?" he asked, nodding at the notebook. She turned it toward him. He read. She watched his face. What she had written was not a legal summary or a financial protocol. It was a reckoning written in the second person, addressed to no one in particular, and therefore to everyone. It was about what happened when the people in a room decided before anyone spoke who was worth listening to. About what those people lost when they made that decision. About what it cost the person who was dismissed. About the particular, pervasive, unremarkable way that a woman's knowledge could inhabit the same space as a man's ignorance for years without ever being permitted to correct it. It was precise, and it was not angry. Anger had never been Abigail's primary register. But it was honest in the way that her father's bookkeeping had been honest, every figure accurately placed. Nothing rounded for comfort, nothing omitted because it was inconvenient. Benjamin read it twice. Then he set it down and was quiet. "You should publish this," he said. She looked at him. "Not under my name," she said. "It wouldn't be received." "Under mine then," he said, "with your authorship acknowledged. There are journals, commercial publications, legal reviews that would take a piece examining the mechanisms of this kind of fraud. And if it were attached to the Whitmore case, which is now public record." He stopped. "It would reach people, other families, other men who are being targeted by people who've decided their wives aren't worth listening to." Abigail was very still. She had not thought about this. She had written it the way she wrote everything, out of the need to get the thing clearly on paper, to see it precisely, to give it the shape it deserved. She had not thought about what happened to it after. "Benjamin," she said slowly, "if your name is on it, my name on it is the point," he said. "If a woman writes about being dismissed, men dismiss it. If a man writes or at least signs about having dismissed his wife and the consequences of that, other men read it differently. He held her gaze. I know that's not how it should be. I know the argument you're about to make. But we are operating in the world as it is, not as it should be. And in the world as it is, my name gets this read by the men who need to read it. She was quiet for a long moment. All right, she said. But the authorship acknowledgement must be explicit. Not in collaboration with, or with assistance from. I want my name on it as the author. Yours as the endorser, the context. Agreed, he said immediately. She looked at him. He looked back. This was always yours, he said. All of it. The case, the protocols, the evidence, this. He gestured at the notebook. I will spend the rest of my life making certain that is understood. By the people around us. By the world where I can make it understood. By, he paused. By you. Because I think you may still sometimes need to hear it. Abigail held his gaze. She thought about the woman who had stood outside a study door and heard herself called a burden, who had gone back to her morning room and opened her notebook, not in despair, but in resolve. Who had built a case alone in the margins of a life that didn't officially recognize her, with her father's methods and her own steady intelligence and the unshakable conviction that what she knew mattered, regardless of whether anyone else was ready to agree. She had saved an estate. She had exposed a criminal operation that had destroyed 5 families and would have destroyed more. She had brought a woman in Bath back from the particular isolation of being a witness to something terrible, with no mechanism for justice. She had changed the administration of her household in ways that would make it genuinely safer and more efficient for years beyond her own direct involvement. And she had changed something in her marriage, not repaired it, not restored it to some prior state of grace, because there was no prior state to restore to. She had built something that hadn't existed before, not from what they'd had, but from what they were capable of being, now that they had both chosen to look directly at each other. I know, she said to Benjamin. I know you mean it. She picked up her pen. She turned to a fresh page. At the top, she wrote the title of the piece, the one that would be submitted to the Commercial and Legal Review of London in November of 1817, published in January of 1818, and read by more men in positions of authority over more households and commercial estates than either Benjamin or Abigail Ashford had permitted themselves to imagine. She wrote, On the Cost of Not Listening. She paused. Then, beneath the title in letters, as clear and as unambiguous as everything she had ever written, she wrote her own name. Abigail Mercer Ashford. The woman they had called a burden. The woman who had carried the weight of everything they valued while they were busy deciding she couldn't. The woman who had not stopped working, not stopped hoping, not stopped believing that the truth assembled carefully and presented clearly and defended without apology would eventually be impossible to ignore. She had been right. She was always going to be right, and now finally the right people knew it.